Hi there, writer friends. We are continuing another episode in this series on editing your manuscript. Today we're going to be talking about self-editing, so let's jump right in here. Welcome to Indie Author Blueprint. Now I want to tell you that today I have a guest in the studio, and I did not invite the guest here. What I have is a buzzing fly in my studio, and I have not been able to get it, and every so often it buzzes my face. And so if you hear it in the background, just know that we had a little guest here today. All right, we're going to be talking about self-editing, and especially this is cleaning up your manuscript before sending it to an editor. Now remember, you can do a lot of this and you can get it pretty clean, but you still need to send it to an editor. The one benefit to doing so much of this and really working on it, though, is that you might get to pay a more reasonable price for the editing, because when your editor looks through it, they might see that it's very clean and there's only a little bit of polishing up to do. And then maybe they'll bid you a quote that's lower than if they had to do all of this for you. So this is why we do this. When you finish writing your book, there's a whole process of self-editing, and it is not done on your first pass. It's done in multiple passes through it. And when you write your book, it's not just a put all the words on the page and then you're one and done. Like it's good. That is not how good writing works. And I know there are people that are convinced that that's how it works, and it's not. And I know this because I've written some things that I was so proud of, and they were just glowing, like an article or something where I'm just glowing, really, not the words. And I'm thinking, this is the best thing I've ever written. And then I set it aside for a little while and I come back maybe the next day and I read it again. Maybe it's months later even. And I realized it needed a lot of work yet. I just really loved the concept and I was so in love with it that I was almost blind to what it really needed. So after you finish writing, you're going to need to polish, move sentences around, clean it up, make it sparkle. So when you step back, you might be surprised by some of the words you repeat or the places where you can really tighten it up. You might also realize that there are some places where it doesn't make sense. I've had some kind of funny things happen when I'm editing, when these dangling participles or dangling modifiers come up, because the beginning of the sentence is supposed to modify what comes after the comma, and the thing that comes after the comma is not really what the person meant. So here's an example of one of those. Crossing over the bridge, a boat caught her eye. Well, the boat was not crossing over the bridge. She was crossing over the bridge. But when it starts out with that modifier there, crossing over the bridge, the next noun, a boat, is what it modifies. And so we have to edit those things and change them. Crossing over the bridge, she saw a boat crossing underneath. So we have to get that right in the right order or things don't make sense. And some of them are really funny and I won't share them here because if somebody's listening and I've edited their work, we don't want to use actual real life examples. I just made that one up. So that wasn't a real life one. So as we're talking about self-editing today, I'm going to go over some of the basics, but then I'm putting out a worksheet specifically for paid subscribers to Indie Author Blueprint. This is a resource to use along with the audio that I'm giving you right now to really work on your manuscript. Now, these resources that I create are available anytime for someone who starts to pay the small monthly subscription. And that small monthly subscription helps me because I'm spending a lot of time developing content. And so that fee just helps to give me a little bit of salary, especially to cover the cost of the tools that I use when I'm creating. Everything is a subscription. I pay the subscription for those things. So you can download those resources. You can print them. You can use them for personal use. They're just not for you to share or repost somewhere else because they are specifically for the paid subscriber. But if you decide to become one of those, you will be able to access that worksheet. And like I said, you can print them or save them so that when you're no longer a subscriber, if you decide to change that someday, you still have the resources that you downloaded in PDF form. So we'll talk a little bit here today about first steps for self-editing and then some common mistakes to fix and a couple of tools that you can use. But then in that resource, I go into very specific things that you can do on passes through. And I'm talking multiple passes through where you're looking at structure and verbs and punctuation, all those things, and you might not do them all at once. So in those first steps, one of the things you want to do when you've finished writing your manuscript is take a little time away from it, because when I finish writing, I'm exhausted and I don't always like it very much. And sometimes I love it, but I don't always love my first draft. And I need some time away because when I'm tired, I don't have fresh eyes. I just want it to be done and over with. And so I'm going to miss a lot of things. So I give it a little bit of time to just kind of simmer on the back burner a little bit. Then I start my editing process. Now, one of the things I found really helpful is to read the manuscript out loud when you're editing, at least on one pass through, because you will catch some errors because it slows you down. And also it helps you when you realize when you're stumbling over a sentence that this is too long and I need to break this one up. It helps me to hear some repetition. I notice I have some pet words I use a lot, and so I take those out. And so reading out loud is really helpful for that. And then common mistakes to fix. There are some things that all of us kind of do. Like there are some things that are just really common. When I'm editing people's work, there are some things that I notice. It's just something that almost every author does. I do them myself when I'm in a hurry. One of the things is redundant words, just using pet words and not being very creative and coming up with a different way to say the same thing. And so we might use the word running a whole bunch of times, and we need to stop and think like, how else can I describe this in another way? We might start sentences with the same word over and over and not realize that 6 in a row started with she. And so all of that helps. There might be some filler phrases we use that are just not really helpful to the point of the sentence. And those can go. Passive voice, where we use a lot of ing, like was going instead of went or something like that. And so it's stronger when we can use that active voice and really use good verbs instead of relying on using those be verbs and an ing word. And then the other thing we might notice is that dialogue and narrative doesn't have a very good flow. And even if you're writing nonfiction, you should have some dialogue in there. You're not telling everything. There's going to be some quoting of stories back and forth. Writing humor, there's always some dialogue in there when I'm writing that. So I'm looking at how that flows. So as we think about all of this, there are some tools we can use, and AI is making this even better because AI is offering us, like, you can write something, put it in there and have it give you some suggestions for how you can polish it, and then you can keep working on it. Now, I don't always like what AI does to it, so we're using this just as a tool, and it's just to give us some ideas. Grammarly is a tool that checks for punctuation, spelling, flow, all of that. And it also uses AI now, where it gives you some suggestions for a way you might want to reword it to make it clearer. It might suggest that you move a sentence from the end to the beginning. And again, I don't always agree with it. Sometimes I think it changes the meaning, or it makes it maybe too mechanical. So it's just for suggestions. I don't use it as like the be-all, end-all. Word has built-in tools to check spelling and grammar and all of that. And again, it doesn't always line up with maybe Merriam-Webster's dictionary, which is what we use for writing books. Maybe doesn't line up with the Chicago Manual of Style, which is what we use. So again, it's a tool, but it'll flag something and we can look at it again. And then Perfect It is another tool that I have. And this one doesn't check spelling and grammar, but it does check to see if maybe you spelled something differently in the beginning of the book and you changed it later. It looks for some common words that you used incorrectly. Like maybe it's supposed to be hyphenated. So it's looking for some of that, but is not the same as using Grammarly. So I have a lot of tools, and I'm putting my book through all these tools as I'm working on it just to see, what does it suggest? What might I change? Now, let's look at some of the things that we check when we're self-editing, and this is going to be a quick overview of these. The first thing is structure and flow. So as you're going through your manuscript, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, whatever it is, you're looking to see, do my chapters have a clear introduction and conclusion? Now, obviously, if you're doing fiction, it's going to be different. You're thinking more about a hook at the beginning of a chapter and something like that leads you to want to keep reading into the next. So that's a little different and yet you're still looking for the beginning and the end of each chapter. So do I have a clear introduction in the chapter? Does it have a strong start? Does it draw people in as they're flipping through and they want to read that chapter? And does it have a strong finish? Now, that finish might be a takeaway for the reader if it's instructional. It might be something to make them think about. It might be something to make them laugh. So whatever format your book takes on, it's going to be different. The other thing you're looking for is logical flow. Are the ideas in the book in your nonfiction or the scenes in your fiction book in an order that enhances the understanding and engagement and makes some kind of meaning for the reader? So this is where sometimes having beta readers read through and you just ask them to give feedback on flow. Are there some places here where it just felt awkward? And they can flag those even if they're not great at grammar and spelling. In fact, sometimes it's better if they're not, because you don't want them to mess with that right now. You just want them to look at how it flows. The other thing you want to look at when you're looking at structure and flow is, are there transitions between sections and paragraphs, or does it feel choppy? And the way I look at this is, if I take out subheadings, if I'm using them, does it still make sense to me? Or am I relying on subheadings because I don't really want to make flow happen? So I look at that. I look at, it's not a term paper like you wrote in school where you have to be quite so obvious, like, therefore I'm saying, not like that. But does it really move into the next idea? Do the thoughts connect in a way that it's meaningful? The other thing I look at when I'm looking at structure and flow is, have I used the same format throughout the book? This is especially true for nonfiction writers. So do I lead off with the same type of format? So I create kind of a template in, let's say I'm writing Bible study, because that's something I write. I have a chapter title. I have an opening thought. I might have a Bible verse. I might have reflection questions. I might have the study and then some at-home work or some discussion questions for a group. Do I have those in every chapter? Are they all the same? Do I start off with the same type of a thing? You'd be surprised at how many authors don't think about that. And so they write their book and one chapter just boom right into the chapter. And then other ones begin with a fancy quote, or they begin with a different kind of heading. And so you want to make sure that you're using sort of the same format throughout. And again, it's a little different with fiction, and yet you still do want to have sort of the same thing. Like I've seen some novels I've read lately where the chapters actually have titles, and that's not as typical. Usually they're just numbered. And so it would be awkward if you had some that were numbered and some that were titled. So that's an example of structure and flow. Okay, number 2, you want to be looking at voice and style. Is it consistent? Is the tone and the voice consistent throughout the manuscript? Does it sound like I wrote the whole thing, or does it sound like in the middle I turn into a lecturer when I was being casual and humorous at one point? So you want to look at that and just see like what kind of flow does that have? I use the word flow a lot, but it just is true. It needs to flow. You want to look at point of view. Are there point of view shifts that happen, and how am I breaking it? Because you can't be in two people's heads at the same time. So you can't know the feelings of more than one person. So you need to either have a scene break where you go into the other person's point of view, or you need to show it in some way in their feelings on their face or the actions, but not as if you're omniscient and you know everybody's thoughts. So that's something to go through and look at when you're editing and see, did I just change point of view? I catch this a lot when I'm editing where people shift. So along with that is, you maybe have heard this many, many times, show, don't tell. Are there places where you could show more through actions and dialogue rather than summarizing or telling as if you're a narrator kind of hovering above the action instead of showing the action? So that covers voice and style as you're reading through. Now, the next part kind of goes along with structure and flow, but it's a little bit different, and that is sentence structure and readability. How long are your sentences? Are they all the same? Like when you read it aloud, does it feel like you're like reading the lyrics to a song because every sentence is exactly the same length? Then that's a good sign that you need to break some of those sentences up. It's okay to use incomplete sentences, to have some short ones in there and break it up. You also want to look at active versus passive voice. I mentioned it a little bit with the ing words and be verbs, but you want to look for active voice where the action is happening, not this mysterious who was doing the action, but you want it to be that someone does it. Here's an example of how that might go. It might say something like, each person was given a cookie. Each person was given. Well, who gave them the cookie? You see, we want to switch it to active voice and say, the grandma gave each child a cookie. Terrible example. I was trying to think on the fly here. Speaking of flies, that one is still in my office here. So that's an example of switching it around so that you can tell who's doing the action. It wasn't just passively happening to the person in the scene. The other thing you want to look for here is clarity. Are there awkward sentences or unclear phrases? Just read through it as if you have seen this now for the very first time and not that you've been working on it for 100 years. And read it like your reader hears it and see if there's something they might misunderstand because you thought it was super clear. Now, once you get all of that stuff done, which is kind of the big picture, kind of more of the macro editing, then you get down to the grammar and punctuation. This is where you're going through and you're looking at grammar, spelling, basic stuff. And this is where that checker is helpful if you're going to run it through something like Grammarly, because it's going to catch some things that you miss. It's going to give you some suggestions for commas and all that kind of stuff. So that's very helpful. And if you catch that you're doing the same thing over and over, then it helps you to learn because you'll do it differently the next time. I cover more of this in the self-editing document that I made. The other thing is to make sure that you're not overusing things like exclamation points. If you have more than one per page, I mean, seriously, sometimes I'm like, you don't need more than one per chapter, but that's just me. I'm a minimalist on those. Except for in my emails and text messaging, then I use 10,000 of them, which is different. We can do that, but just make sure you're not using very many of them. If you find yourself needing to use them, that means you're going to have to switch up and make some stronger and more creative dialogue or more creative description or something like that. You don't always have to use those. And the same thing goes for things like italics and bold and underlining, which we don't really do in books. We don't really underline things, but minimize that stuff. I also talk in the self-editing guide about ellipses. So I'll just say here that is a mark of amateur writing if I open a book or a manuscript and I see a ton of ellipses used. So I explain the difference in the handout on the different dashes and ellipses and how they are used. As you're going through then, you will also be looking for number 5, word choice and repetition. Looking for things that you say over and over, phrases that you tend to repeat. You're going to be looking for cliches and things that are tired old expressions. For example, if your character is turning beet red, that's an old one. Find something new to describe the redness in their face and why they're blushing. Older than dirt is another cliche. Okay, so look for something fresh. Sometimes it's hard to keep thinking of things, but instead of describing, sometimes that's where dialogue comes in then, where I don't need to use a cliche. Make sure you're using strong verbs, descriptive language. Don't get too flowery, but also make sure you're not just using the same old boring stuff, because that was the run, spot, run stuff that I learned in first grade. See Jane run, see Spot run. That was boring, wasn't it? So now we have all these creative words that we can use. And so make your writing interesting. And this is what happens in the editing phase. I encourage you, when you're actually doing the writing, to go ahead and give yourself permission to use the cliches, to use the boring words and stuff. If it means you're not going to stop what you're doing, like let the writing flow, and then you go back and then you really make it shine, because I think getting the ideas down is really important. And I don't want to pause and get the thesaurus out and really look at stuff, because it wrecks the flow. That's just how it works for me. All right, we have 2 more things here. Number 6, dialogue. As you're editing, ask if the dialogue sounds like something a real person would say. Is it natural sounding? Sometimes it sounds really stilted. And if somebody uses too many dialogue tags, that's the said or asked. And by the way, we don't want to get creative with those. I'll come back to that in a second. But if every single one is da 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 da, she said, da 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 da, he said, da 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 da, she said, it's just really boring. And you don't need to use dialogue tags on all of those. If you can tell who's speaking, drop some of those off of there, but then read the dialogue and see if it sounds like real people or if it sounds like terribly bad play acting. And then you want to just make that, freshen it up. Listening to people have conversations. I love to people watch. That's how you hear how natural conversations go. Now, the dialogue tags. Some people had English teachers that taught them to get really creative. Stop using said. This is the exception to the repetition. Don't worry about changing up the word said, except for once in a while if you want to use the word asked, because it's a question. But don't worry about adding in expressed or she whispered or she queried or something like that. Just drop that stuff and it just let said kind of fade into the background and just be there to let the reader know who's speaking, but let your dialogue be the thing that really shines. And then the other thing is to look at if the dialogue has the right pacing. Do they speak a lot? Do they not speak enough? And so this is really where you work on maybe taking some of your description and moving it into dialogue because somebody's not saying enough and you just need to have some back and forth. The final thing that you're looking for when you're going through, and this is just an overview, there are more things you're looking for. The final thing I'm talking about today is formatting and consistency. And I mentioned it a little bit at the beginning, but the format of a chapter is that have all the same elements as the other chapters. But you also want to look at chapter headings and subheadings. If you're using subheadings, did you use them on all the chapters or did you forget to put them in? How many are you using? Are you using one kind of main subheading and then you're using something else for like smaller sections under that? So you want to look at that. You want to look at your font, like your sizes and styles, and make sure you like when it's just the draft, just use Times New Roman, don't get fancy. But you might want to change up the font size so you can tell like, oh, that one's going to be this kind of heading, and that one's going to be this kind of heading. And then you want each chapter to start on a new page with a page break, not by hitting enter 10,000 times. So all of those kinds of things, the formatting, really get familiar with Word. This is what we use in the professional writing world. Your editors are going to use Word with track changes. Really important to just go ahead and get that Office 365 subscription. Use all of the benefits. You can share documents with people. You have your files backed up so that if your computer crashes, you still have your manuscript. So get the subscription. It's like about $60 for the year. And then take some tutorials online if you don't know how to use Word. Like formatting paragraphs is really important, and you're not going to want to hit tab or a bunch of spaces. You want to learn how to use the paragraph formatting tools that are in Word, because then you can professionally set up your manuscript and an editor's not going to have to go back in and delete all those things that you added in there, all those extra spaces and stuff like that. I think that's all we're going to cover right here because I cover more, like I said, in that guide. The only other tip that I have for you is if you have some habits that are hanging out yet from something you learned in school. Like, for example, I learned how to type on a real typewriter and we had to use 2 spaces. That has been gone for several decades. And so if you're still typing with 2 spaces after every sentence before the next sentence, you really want to work on those habits, because each time you break one of those habits, maybe you learn to add a comma every time you're supposed to take a breath, but you didn't actually learn the comma rules because that's not what they're for. They each have a particular use. If you learn some of those things and you work on unlearning them now, you not only become a good editor, but you become a better writer. And so as you work on those habits and you self-edit, you will see some of your own habits, your own inconsistencies. And every time I edit something, for myself or for somebody else, I learn something new and I apply that to my writing that I do in the future. So work on it. Be diligent about it. Be okay with how long it takes and how much work goes into it, because that's what makes you really shine as a writer. So that's all I'm going to talk about here as we talk about self-editing. And then the rest will be in a worksheet. I'm going to go over in a little more detail some things you can do with word usage, verb, sentence and structure, a little bit more on punctuation, and some more formatting details. And then I'll start a discussion in Substack where the paid members are able to go in and ask any questions. Now, a lot of times there are no questions, but if you do have a question, you can ask that there or start a discussion. I will not entertain any debates about the serial, which is the Oxford comma. We will just follow the Chicago Manual of Style on that and use it. And so I'm looking for specifically questions about some of those Chicago Manual of Style rules. I'm happy to discuss those and to have a really good discussion about how you can become a better self-editor. All right, next time we're going to be talking more about editing. We'll continue the series and we'll wrap it up really soon. But in the next episode, I'm going to be talking about what to look for in a book editor, kind of how to match yourself up and know who to hire. And then there will be another episode on what to do when you get your edits back from the editor. And then we'll wrap it up with a really brief covering of things like beta readers and stuff like that. So we have a couple more things to cover in upcoming episodes before we jump into cover design, which I'll be covering very soon and talking about some of the principles of covers. And I know that really matters. So hang in there. After we get through the editing, we get to think about the creative stuff. All right. Thanks for being here on this episode of Indie Author Blueprint. I will see you next time.